Maybe you here probably know is was with Aspire Public Schools for 11 years. 11 years in a couple of different capacities, COO, and then regional superintendent of their Bay Area schools, and is now just recently joined a New Schools Venture Fund. So I think she will have both sort of a statewide as well as now a more national perspective on issues around charter quality and growth. Diane Tavner is the co-founder and CEO of Summit Public Schools, a small but pretty rapidly growing charter management organization started in Redwood City. So I guess I'm going to open it up with, my first question is around, I think, sort of conditions for success. We heard, a number of the speakers in the film talk about autonomy, accountability, and choice as being sort of key success factors. Would love to sort of hear, from both of you about, what you think the key ingredients are to the, to the sort of performance of the schools that you've been involved in running. And just to put it in context, love for you to sort of say a few words about, both Aspire in your case and Summit in terms of, performance and the student population you serve. Why don't we start with Gloria?
So Aspire Public Schools, for those of you who don't know, was started almost 15 years ago now, and serves predominantly low-income students in urban areas focused in California. And when we started, the idea of a charter management organization did not exist. There were some for-profit organizations like Edison Schools. There were a bunch of charter schools that were single standalone sites started by groups of parents or teachers that had an idea of what they wanted to do.
Put your teacher voice on.
Huh? Put my teacher voice on, exactly. So when we started Aspire, this idea of a nonprofit that was going to run many charter schools was a little foreign to the world, and we had to convince people that it was a good idea. And over time, we were really proud, actually, of the effectiveness with which we served kids, and were able to get kids into college. And eventually, we served kids K through 12. And I think Aspire now has 35 schools, and is actually for the first time next year expanding out of state in Memphis. I've been asked many times kind of what was the secret sauce at Aspire, and when I was early on in Aspire, I went to visit a number of high-performing other charter schools across the country, and one of those schools that I visited was Roxbury Prep in Boston. And Brett Pizer, who was then the principal of Roxbury Prep, is now the CEO of Uncommon Schools, which is a network that Roxbury Prep lives under, said to me, to the secret sauce question, Gloria, there's no secret sauce. There's no 100% solution to running a great school. There are 101% solutions, right? This is another way to say it's really hard, it's really complicated. There's a lot of things that you need to work on to make a good school, and there's no silver bullet. So that said, as a preface, I will underscore kind of the theme. One of the themes that recurs in the film is the importance of great teachers, and that's definitely an essential ingredient. And then you need to think about, well, what do you need to do in order to attract great teachers, support good teachers into becoming great teachers, continue to retain great teachers, and keep them growing and vibrant. And so then there's all these other things that you do around creating good working conditions, and giving them professional growth opportunities, helping them be successful, helping them know that they're being successful despite all the hardship that there might exist in the community, giving them professional opportunities for growth, paying them fairly, lots of other things that you then need to do to keep good teachers. The principal is often a really important factor in teacher satisfaction, in the same way that in any workplace, your supervisor is a huge driver of employee satisfaction. The same is true in schools, and the principal can have a lot to do with whether a teacher is happy. So I guess I'll just pause on that.
Great, and we'll come back to some of the issues on working conditions.
Awesome. So I was a teacher in LA, interestingly, at the school that Green Dot initially started to compete with because it was such a terrible nightmare dropout factory, and almost left the profession because it was so demoralizing. Fortunately, I didn't. I came to Northern California and stuck with it. And in 2003, got the opportunity to start a school from scratch. And so my sort of design theory around starting the school was, as a teacher, felt like I was set up for failure. Like my best chance at success was that I could sort of save a few of the kids that I taught, but the vast majority of them were going to be lost to the system. And it didn't really matter how great I was, as we heard the themes here tonight. I could never do everything I needed to do for my kids. And that's primarily by design. I mean, we still have factory model schools in America. The vast majority of our schools are factories. They were designed that way, and they weren't designed to get the outcomes that we currently need today. And so my design principle, when I designed Summit, was design a school that will set every single teacher up for success, because if every teacher is set up for success, they will be successful with their kids, and their kids will then be successful. Let's just try that for a while. And so, what we've done at Summit is sort of create the ideal school. I just put everything in there that I thought would be ideal. So, our teachers teach one prep per year. They teach only 100 kids. They often stay with those kids multiple years and loop with them. Every student has an adult mentor who stays with them for multiple years as the liaison with the family, and time to meet with those kids is built in every day. Our teachers have, brace yourself for this one, 40 days of professional development a year built into their work. And they collaborate extensively across the school, and now schools, we have multiple schools. And so literally we built everything, that we have no contracts, and it's pay for performance before anyone was talking about merit-based pay, all of those sorts of things. And we've been really successful. We've got near 100% college acceptance rate, and waiting lists like crazy, and demands to open in multiple other cities, which we've done. And then here's the interesting part of my story at this point. 2 years ago, we got our first data from our first graduating class, who had been out of college for 4 years, or out of high school for 4 years. And so our mission is to prepare every student for success in college. So what happened? We had to look at that data. And as an organization that prides itself on looking at data and continuous improvement, you got to look at that data. So the good news is we beat all national averages, and most folks, 55% of our kids from that first class earn a 4-year degree in 6 years. The bad news is I know those other 45% of those kids because I taught them and I led them, and that was unacceptable for us. So just doubling national averages and beating, that wasn't good enough. And so that launched us into an effort to really think about redesigning again, to figure out where do we need to go next, because we've done everything that supposedly best practice says is going to get us where we need to go, and we're still not hitting the mark. And there's huge questions about if that's scalable. So what can we do to think about redesign? And so that's the process my organization is in right now. A pretty ambitious process to rethink not just doing the factory model really, really well, which with all due respect, I will argue that's what the best charter schools in this country are doing. They took the factory model and they are doing it well, really, really well in ways that school districts are not. But they didn't really yet fully innovate on the model of school and create a 21st century school, a next generation school. And so that's the work we're engaged in currently. It's a little ambitious. I am the crazy lady in the room who's like taken her very successful schools and is like, we're going to blow them up and we're going to do something different.
Can you actually say a little bit about what that's looking like at your pilot?
Yeah, it's not a pilot anymore. Okay. So we've been piloting for the last 2 years, and got really engaged in lean startup principles and really converted our organization to build, measure, learn cycle in a really disciplined way. And the pilot last year caused us to do a full redesign that I thought would be implemented in our 2 new schools, and that was it. But not only the 2 new schools, but the existing 4 schools all want to converge. So in a couple of weeks, we will have brand new schools. Pretty ambitious, pretty crazy. It's pretty crazy.
And what are some of the design
Yeah,
elements that you're putting in place?
The biggest design element, and this one, we did a ton of research about what was really holding our kids back in college, is that it flips the entire school on its head and said it's all about, our job is to teach kids how to own and drive their own learning and to be self-directed, and to our job is to facilitate the process of them learning how to do that, and then give them opportunities to personalize their pathway. And it is a competency-based progression as opposed to a seat time. I was struck by the film where we're talking about, teachers are step in column. Well, kids are too. Like, it's not a competency-based progression that's in the factory model. And so it's competency-based progression. There's very thoughtful but heavy leveraging of technology to make a ton of things possible. Instant actionable feedback for kids, and a whole system that literally allows kids to sort of see where you are today, where you want to go, if you're on that trajectory or not, and if you're not on it, exactly what you can and need to do in order to get back on trajectory. And then a whole personal coaching model around how to keep going forward.
One of the things that I actually want to highlight is that I think that really good schools of any type and organizations actually do what you do, which is basically you don't make any assumptions about what it is that's making you successful, but you continue to innovate and challenge and question, and it's never good enough, right? You're always kind of pushing and pushing and pushing. And I feel like the good schools and organizations that we see have that trait kind of almost in their DNA, and actually kind of get their kids to believe that too, right? And so that the kids, it really is like growth mindset, like on steroids, right? But to the extent that the kids are just, okay, well, that's my data. I'm not settling for that. I want to go for the next step, right? And to do that as kids, as teachers, as an entire school or school system.
Yep. To that point, our new teacher orientation starts tomorrow. It's 3 days long, and one full day of new teacher orientation in our organization is a design summit. Like, we teach design thinking, and they design and learn the process. That's also one of the full days for student orientation. So we teach everyone design thinking, and one of my favorite stories last year is I was literally walking through a pilot, and we've taught this so well that I go back to my computer and I have a little email from a student who saw me walking through, and it's titled User Feedback. I was getting some user feedback about what can be done better.
Okay. I'm actually curious to hear sort of your reaction to this notion of, even the highest performing charter schools sort of replicating like a traditional school model, and to what extent are you seeing, more schools like Summit that are really, thinking outside of the box in terms of kind of educational model?
So I think it's definitely true, especially the kind of the first wave of high-performing charters and CMOs. And actually, almost all, I would say probably all of the high-performing CMOs that I've seen have gone through the exact same process as Summit, which is to say they saw their kids who were scoring, kind of way better than the district on every standardized test score, right? And then they get to college, and then they don't succeed. And everybody has had like the kind of crisis of mission, I guess, like, oh my God, what happened? What did we do wrong? And has kind of gone back through. I know Aspire went through that a couple of years ago and is still kind of going through that and rethinking the model on many different dimensions, not just in terms of how do you incorporate technology, for example, but how do you raise the level of rigor even more? How do you change the pedagogical practices so that you're really truly preparing kids for the kinds of experiences they're going to have in college, say like in a freshman seminar, right? Or in a big lecture hall, right? So, all the high-performing charters have started to rethink the model. And what we're seeing now is more, with my new schools hat on, some new charter organizations starting that are really trying to, take advantage of the technology that's available, maybe some more flexibility that might exist, to basically say, well, let's see if we can start closer to being from scratch. Now, the reality is, especially at the high school level, you might try to think out of the box, but then you quickly find yourself in the box of higher ed, right? Meaning that you still have to, in California, have your kids meet the A through G requirements, and the A through G is unfortunately more seat time oriented than it is competency based.
No, we're
Right? We're going to change
that.
that, but it isn't yet, right? Or we're working on it.
It's going to be this fall.
Okay. So there are things that anybody who's trying to start a brand new school kind of finds themselves running up against. even despite the charter autonomy.
Great. Well, that's a good segue into my next question. We've definitely talked about the barriers, I think, to innovation. You know, given that we are in California, we also obviously have a number of high-performing charters, but still, you know, when you look at the sort of student population drop in the bucket, you know, relative to number of students that need high-quality schools. Can you talk a little bit about like what are the barriers that you encountered in terms of opening new schools, and what do you think it's going to take to sort of scale high-quality charters in California specifically? Or you can start.
My other hat I wear is I chair the California Charter
Yes.
Association Board, so I spend a lot of time on this. I mean, there's some just well-known facts. So facilities are the #1 barrier to starting schools, and particularly for CMOs for replicating high-performing charters. They're super expensive, they're hard to get. Even though we have a law in California, you essentially have to sue the districts to get facilities. So facilities, #1 barrier for charters, hands down. And then a close second would be funding, and I think specifically startup funding to get going. It's challenging. So I think those are the two barriers. I think we've come a long way in the 20 years to sort of take down a lot of the other barriers. You know, we're in the process now where we're like Aspire sort of opening charters every single year, and you know, it's a process now, and we're even getting approved locally at local levels sometimes in the first go around, which is kind of amazing. So you know, there's things like
Sad
that
feels like accomplishment,
exactly, but it
reality.
is. So I think in terms of right now, about a little over 8% of California's kids are in charter schools. So significantly more than we have had in the past, but still, as you said, 90% of the kids need a great school in the state. And so, you know, I think I'm not alone in being one of the people to think that, you know, we are literally not going to open enough charter schools in California to serve all these kids. And so a lot of work in the reform movement is about how to, you know, sort of get the magic answer to how charters actually jump to schools. And I think there's a couple of pathways. I think the most promising, honestly, is to let the charter-like rules jump to the public school districts. And there's some movement on that. So the one positive outcome of the financial crisis was that they freed up a lot of California schools to do a whole bunch of things that looked a lot like charter regulation and law when that happened. There's some really interesting cities across the country and superintendents who are starting to do that type of work for their districts. And so I see some real promise there. I really think if we open up the districts to have the same rules, the same autonomy as charter schools, that there are a lot of amazing people in districts who are going to do incredible things. We're going to see a huge jump very, very quickly. So I think that's the biggest sort of broad-based strategy, but I think the other thing we're doing is coming into sort of the second phase of charters. I think the first phase of charters was, I think we accomplished two big things. One, we proved that you can, at scale, prepare any and all kids for success, regardless of their preparation background. And most people believed you couldn't educate these kids, and charters have proved that to be wrong. So I think that was critically important. And number two, we broke the monopoly. So, you know, there is a crack in the monopoly, and those two things are huge. But I think we're coming into the second wave of what charters can and should do, and I really think that is about the innovation piece. So as charters have always held out the promise of being the laboratories of innovation, and I think it's time we now come into our own on that and actually live up to that expectation.
What are your thoughts about barriers and
Ditto.
Yeah. On the funding question, I mean, obviously, funding is a huge barrier, particularly in California. I mean, what do you think the likelihood of, you know, sort of changing California's sort of public school funding formula are?
Oh, it just
in our
happened.
lifetime?
It did. We just did it.
Right. Well, that sort of frees up.
Still remains to be seen what it ended up looking
I mean,
like.
in terms of sort of, I
Yeah.
guess, increasing per pupil funding.
That's an interesting question for me, because I'm not
Maybe
one of
that's
those-
something Josh's
yeah.
firm can
I mean, that's
tackle
not,
after.
well, that lawsuit specifically doesn't speak to money by design, but, yeah, I mean, I think that it is, here's how we look at it, like, unless schools are actually producing results with kids that create more economic value, at some level there's only so much money to invest in them. And so, I mean, we are not an organization that cries about the amount of money we get. We've always been about, this is the amount of money we get, we have a job to do on it, and we do it, and we operate sustainably on it. And so I'm not the.
So Summit schools are 100%.
They have a
sort of reach.
startup grant, and once they reach student capacity, they have to operate on the state allocation. That's the rule in our organization.
And that's the way Aspire is designed too. It's not the way that all charter schools are organized. And the other thing I would say about funding is that because charter schools, for the most part, end up having to pay a not insignificant amount for their facility, if you could solve the facility problem, charter schools would have more money for the program.
Great. Well, I'm going to stop there. I want to make sure we have time for questions and open it up to the audience. So.
This question is for Diana. I was wondering if you're funding a lot of your innovation and research and design with those same public dollars, or are you saying, look, this is actually a laboratory and we need to think about this differently, and this is not what those dollars are for?
Yep. So up until very recently, yes, we were funding with our, ongoing sort of very frugally piloting within the schools and finding ways to do that. In the last year, we did decide to go sort of big on this pilot. And everything we're building actually is, our philosophy about building it is that it will be publicly shared and open under Creative Commons. So everything we're building is free and accessible, and we're putting a whole bunch of stuff online and whatnot. So we have taken in some sort of R&D dollars to do that, which is interesting because those aren't generally available in education. We're actually trying to sort of talk about why. Maybe that's one of the reasons why we don't have innovation, is there aren't a lot of R&D or dollars, but we are doing some of our funding with that at this point.
In the gentleman in the back.
I wanted to ask you about the accusation of creaming with regard to charter schools, because based on my own experience teaching in a well-regarded charter network at a school that was not successful, turnaround only really occurred with a reboot in the culture that told parents and families this is a school of choice, we have a wait list, and actually did lead to the withdrawal of some of the most challenging students. And all of our students remain low income, all of our students remain from the neighborhood that the district school was drawing from, but it struck me that that shift towards the folks who are aligned in terms of mindset and attitude was pretty significant. And that's always been a challenge for me to defend charter schools. So I'd just be curious to know how you've addressed that in your schools and your thinking around that.
So I think just from the sort of macro level, what I can say is we've been really meticulous about gathering data from the time we started that looks at, and there's several research studies out there that are doing this, that literally looks at the kids who come to charter school and the kids who don't, particularly the ones who were lotteried in versus lotteried out. What's their profile, how are they different, and how do they perform differently? And so in our case, like in many of these other studies, our kids actually come in underperforming their peers and their counterparts in the district, and then have significantly better performance coming out. So when you're talking about pure preparation and demographics and things, I think there's a very clean argument that we are not creaming. It might be happening in some places, but I actually think the vast
I don't think
majority
about academic preparation as much as
I'm going to get to the
Okay.
second one. So I think the second piece that you're speaking to is this notion that at some level doing learning and getting through school and getting prepared for college is really, really hard work. And there's a lot of factors that impact that, not just poverty and family, but literally, and this is why grit is such a big thing now, and what we call it the habits of success continuum. So, and what I think is really interesting, and we see this with some families, is when push comes to shove, there's choices that families are making that are really impacting their kids' ability to learn. bottom line. And you can put amazing teachers and all these other things in place. And when there's a school right down the street that's not going to hold them to high standards and that they can sort of take the easier way, unfortunately there are some families who are going to choose that. Is that creaming when they make that choice? I don't know. I mean, you know, at some point we're going to have to deal with that as a society. I think right now they're going, all kids who really are willing to try hard don't have the opportunity because they're in schools that don't give them that pathway. And so there's so many more kids we need to serve. At some level, I'm like, you know, if the demographics are still, we're serving all the kids that we need to be serving and some are choosing out, I have less of an issue with that at the moment. I think that's a problem for a future day, personally.
So I think that this is one of those topics where it's not fair to lump all charters together. Like actually most topics related to charter schools, because there really is such diversity in charters. So there absolutely are some charters I think that cream, and there are also many that don't. And so there actually is the Office of Civil Rights, or the Division of Civil Rights within the Department of Education is actually has been gathering data on the rate of suspensions and expulsions of kids in all different kinds of schools. And over the next year or two, they're going to release some sort of study on that. And my guess is that it will come out and show that there are some high-performing charters that part of the reason they're high-performing is because they have been disproportionately counseling out, you know, suspending, expelling, whatever, kids that somehow didn't fit. And I would say to those charters, like, we have to do better, right? If we're going to take the moral high ground and hold up high-performing charters as proof points of showing that all kids can really learn at high levels, then, you know, we have to change our practices around that.
Yes.
I work for Bloomberg, which I think you probably both are pretty familiar with, our educator effectiveness tool. One thing I've noticed is that every different charter in every different state we talk to says we do things a little differently here, which on the one hand is great, everybody can kind of do things differently, but you guys are talking about charters as a laboratory for what really works, and I've seen it. Like, I know both of your systems pretty well. Like, what do you do with that contradiction, with the idea of, like, we've seen this works, use it here, and people spending millions of dollars to reinvent the wheel or make a new something of the Danielson framework or whatever it is, you know?
Yeah. I do think there's a lot of reinventing the wheel that I think is unnecessary. And, you know, if you've got a different program model or education model, you know, the part of what makes a high-performing school or high-performing system high-performing is the internal alignment of all the different pieces, right? That you've got a certain educational model, the behavior management is aligned with that, the way that wants to work. You've hired teachers that believe in that are trained to do that model. You've got families that want to do that kind of program. You've got your budget that's aligned to the priorities in that system. And so almost by definition, you know, you are going to have some variations. But I also feel like people overblow that we're different. And there's kind of like, there's a range. Right, that I bet you're finding with your program that, well, you could customize this and this and this, and you might call this category something different, but it's essentially this.
I think what is underneath what you're talking about is a legitimate thing we have to deal with, which is, you know, one of the reasons a lot of these charters are high performing is that everyone in the charter is really deeply engaged in the work. They understand it, they're playing with it, they're inventing, like, they're deeply engaged. They're not just taking a curriculum off the shelf and, like, saying open to page 32 and read that page and answer those questions. And so by definition, to be deeply engaged in that, you're going to have your own ideas and all of those pieces. And so I think the question is, how do we allow people to be deeply engaged with what they're doing and be deeply engaged with what already exists and feel like they own it and feel like it's theirs and feel like it's personalized, and at the same time not do the work of reinventing the wheel. And you know, we're right now in a really interesting place in my organization because for the last 10 years, my original theory was, like, we're hiring amazing teachers. They're going to they all develop their own curriculum, they're incredible, you know, like, but then we're gonna like share it with each other and we're gonna pass it on and we're just gonna make it better. And I have this vision for this iterative process, and every teacher comes in and makes their own curriculum every year. I'm like, no guys, that was not the plan here, all right? Like, how do we, and so we've tried so many ways to make that not happen. And I'm hoping that we're on the one that's actually gonna stick, which is a process whereby our teachers literally are creating a full aligned grades 6 through 12, 5 subjects, common assessment system that includes a whole robust set of performance tasks as well as content and assessments. And it will be used across the entire organization by all the teachers and released publicly for anyone and everyone to use. But the key is, great, these teachers are deeply invested because they're creating it, but what happens when next year we hire new ones and they didn't create it? And so the companion piece to that is the build, measure, learn process literally built into our system, so they're constantly iterating on it, using the data and things like that. And so we're hoping that is the solution to what you're pointing out, which is we've got to use stuff that exists. It's crazy what we're doing, but we also have to find ways that people are meaningfully engaged with it and own it and make it theirs and keep it fresh. And
Customize it for
Yeah,
the kids that
yeah.
they happen to have.
Yeah.
But I do, so I think that there's a kind of cost, time, energy trade-off here, right? And also quality. So I was talking to the principal of a very high-performing charter school in DC recently, who was telling me a story about how she had hired somebody, a literacy specialist, to do pull-out groups with the kids that were really struggling the most with reading. By all accounts, this literacy specialist was a complete rock star, had just incredible credentials, and for the first 6 months just couldn't get results with kids. And finally, the principal said, you know what, like, we bought this program, it's supposed to be an award-winning program, why don't you just try the program the way the program was designed? And she did, and the kids did great. And this literacy specialist said, oh my God, like, here I thought that I was this huge expert, I was creating all of this stuff that I thought was specially designed for this group of kids, and then it turns out that, that publisher that spent a bazillion dollars developing that program, actually that there was something to that. So I think it's hard because, people are endlessly creative, and in many ways it's a lovely, lovely thing. And on the other hand, like, I don't do
yeah,
it.
exactly.
Any final questions? Yes.
So my questions are.
Apologize for the background noise. I think
Yeah.
that's a subtle message that we should be wrapping up soon.
Yeah, is around the human capital development trajectory, and I think that many charter school management organization or charter schools themselves have experiences where there's high burnout, high turnover, long, sort of less long trajectories of career. And I'm curious to hear, I know some of the work that's going on around the teaching evaluation and expanding career ladders that they referenced in the film and that I've seen on the ground. But how do we work so that that's a systematic experience, not just within charter schools and that development of that human capital, but more to, an entire public system? What are your thoughts about the translation between what's been successful in some successful charter management organizations to more schools?
So I think you asked a couple of different questions.
Yeah.
Yeah, probably like 5, but.
In terms of the translation of it, so many high-performing charter systems have different career paths for teachers, so that you can go from being a beginning teacher to being a more experienced teacher to being a master teacher or an instructional coach. And so for high-performing and ambitious teachers, there's a chance for continued professional development and kind of stretching and, kind of professional progression, a feeling of professional progression. I think that's really hard to translate in a district system with a thick contract.
I think the other issue is districts don't have a problem with keeping teachers for a really long time. That's what they do. They keep them for their whole career, and probably a lot of them that we don't want them to keep for their whole career. And so, from my perspective, perhaps a little bit controversial in some circuits, I don't know that we need teachers to teach for 30 years. I'm not convinced that that's the biggest bang for the buck for anyone involved. I'm pretty happy if I have teachers who teach, somewhere between 4 and 8 years, and are really good and do that really well. And I'm ecstatic when I am able to keep them in my organization and or the profession in some other role after that. And I think that's a huge, so we've just sort of reshaped our thinking around that. I'm not looking for the 30-year commitment for teachers in the classroom doing the same thing for 30 years. I think if we can get, you know, like I said, somewhere between 4 to 8 in a classroom, and then we have a whole, we call it the career matrix, not ladder, because we don't want to imply that you're climbing up. There's lots of opportunity. You know, keeping them in, and we've been incredibly successful at that. In the 10 years, we've retained 84% of the people we've ever hired in our organization to this day. So, been really, really successful and have very high retention.
Great, we'll take one final question. Any last burning questions? Great, well, a huge thank you to Gloria and Diane.